Yes, hello once again, and another very warm welcome from all of us here at Classic Dirt Bike TV. And as you can see, we're out and about once again, and today we're here to cover round 6 of the Scottish Classic Motorcycle Racing Club's 2023 Racing Championship. Now this of course is the penultimate round of the Scottish calendar. We have one more event left to run, and that will of course be at Whitekirk at the end of September, so not too much racing left to close down our 2023 racing season. Now we will have the usual classes here at Avonbridge for our day's event, with the pre-1968s, pre-1975 classes, and of course those pre-1984s or twin shock class as they used to be known. And we'll also have some racing from those little 125 pre-1989 screamers as well. Now this particular track here at Avonbridge is like a hillside type track. It's relatively flat, so no awkward berms or big jumps for these old bikes to encounter. So we're looking forward to some good racing here at this round 6 event. But of course, before we do that, we're going to head back to the paddock and just take a quick look at some of those nice bikes that are soon to take part in this round 6 event here at Avonbridge. Okay, so our first bike that we're going to feature is this quite nicely restored 1980 MC250 Myco belonging to Ian Marr, which is actually almost identical to the bike that I raced myself back in the day, but we're just going to have a quick look around this bike here, as I hope to do a more in-depth feature on Ian's 250 in a future video here on my channel. But as you can see, it's been very well refurbished and has more or less all of the correct parts bolted onto it, although there are a couple of components that are maybe not original on Ian's bike, but nevertheless this is still a lovely example of one of these 1980 German twin shockers. Now of course these 1980 models weren't exactly the greatest bikes that Myco made, because you tended to sort of sit inside the bike rather than sit on top of it, and for some reason I always found them quite hard to turn corners. But then again, of course, that could have just have been me and my lack of motocross talent. Although despite their dubious handling, these 250 Myco motors were certainly very good power plants, and I had this 250 in the bigger 440 engine, which again was a fantastic motor. And as long as you swapped the gearbox oil after every race event and kept your eye on those primary chains, there wasn't really an awful lot that went wrong with these engines. But you can see here that Ian's swapped his old original Bing carburetor for this much more modern Mikuni, which is a bit of an upgrade for this Myco motor. But I always found that if you get a good Bing carburetor and set it up properly and running right, they were every bit as good as one of these modern Mikunis. But essentially these piston port 250 two-stroke Myco motors were a perfect club rider's engine, because they weren't as powerful as maybe say the 440 or even the scary 490s, but if you wanted a bike that you could compete in the 250 class, then these 1980 bikes are a decent choice. Although if you could find one of the 1981 models, which is a much better handling chassis, it's a better option, because everybody knows the 1981 Myco twin shock frame is still regarded as one of the best motocross twin shock chassis ever made. But of course, as I mentioned, we'll certainly take a much closer look at this bike in more detail in a future video here on Classic Dirt Bike TV, because it'll be a little walk down memory lane for me personally, and I'm pretty sure that you'll also enjoy looking more closely at more of the parts that went into this bike's restoration. Now, here's another bike that you certainly don't see every day at these old classic and twin shock race events, and this bike here is Jason Miller's big RM 500 Suzuki, which I'm sure is a 1984 model, another big open class big bore two-stroker, which as I recall I think were pretty damn quick bikes way back in their day. Now, these big RM 500 Suzukis were powered by this monster two-stroke reed valve motor, which, as I remember, I think these engines pumped out around the 53 horsepower mark, which was quite impressive for a 1984 off-road dirt bike. Although I have to say that back in the day it was certainly a very special kind of rider that could ride these big Suzukis to the max, which I suppose was much the same for all of the other big Japanese 500s that were on the go at that time, because it was a bit like a bit of a joisting match between all of the big off-road dirt bike manufacturers of that time, just to see who could build the biggest, baddest and fastest motocrosser on the planet. Although it was only really just a select few who could genuinely ride these open class bikes to their full potential, because in reality these open class bikes were a lot faster than your average rider had the skills to master. And without question, our big RM500 certainly had one of the best rear suspension setups for that year, with Suzuki's excellent full floater rear swing arm and monoshock combination, which was still considered as one of the best suspension systems among all of the big four Japanese manufacturers of that 1980s period. But certainly it is still quite good to see one of these big RM500 Suzukis again, because as I mentioned, you don't see many of these bikes still racing these days, but you can certainly see this bike in action on the track if you return to CDB TV to take a look at all of the racing highlights from this event, which will be coming up here on my channel quite soon. Now, this was another iconic little bike that I came across during my stroll around the paddock, and this 1973 or 74 Honda CR250 Elsinore was being raced by Barry Smith. Now, Barry also had a for sale sign on this bike, as it appears he was wanting to move the bike on, but there was no contact number displayed so that I could post for any interested parties that may be in the market for a nice 250 LC race bike. But what can you see about these iconic little Elsies that hasn't already been documented? A bike that of course changed the entire landscape of off-road racing when Honda first introduced them, which I think was around 1973, and they gained legendary status when some of them were used in Bruce Brown's epic film documentary on Any Sunday, when the great Steve McQueen was seen to be riding one. And after that, it just seemed that every off-road rider on the planet just had to get their hands on a little 125 or even 250 Elsinore Honda. Although, as you're aware, this bike is still regarded as Honda's first ever purpose-built off-road dirt bike, because many of the other so-called trail or dirt bikes that Honda made before this Elsinore were really just road bikes with knobbly tyres fitted onto them. But one of the other factors to consider with regards these two-stroke Elsies is that when Soichiro Honda began building motorcycles for Honda, he vowed at that time that his company would never ever build a two-stroke engine. But when he saw the sales that their competitors like Kawasaki, Suzuki and Yamaha were making on their two-stroke motorcycles, he had no choice but to then run with the pack. So as you can no doubt gather, these little Honda Elsinores have certainly secured their place in the motorcycle history books, and this example here of Barry Smith's is of course not a fully original bike from that early 1970s period, but it's still worthy of a few minutes of airtime here on my classic dirt bike TV channel. Okay, so next up it's a quick look at Sam Sibbald's big TT500 4-stroke Yamaha. Just one of the very few pre-1977 race bikes that were actually racing at this round 6 event here at Avonbridge. Now this bike here might not be that much to look at, but it can certainly shift when it takes to the track, as you'll soon discover. Now these big TTs or XTs were powered by these big 500cc 4-stroke power plants, which were reasonably powerful and almost unbreakable when it came to their reliability, and even in their stock original state, these 4-banger Yamaha motors were still very quick. But there's definitely a thriving market out there for tuning and upgrading these engines just to get more horsepower out of them, and when it's done right with using bigger valves and racing cams and boring out the cylinders, these relatively mundane engines can be turned into ultra competitive fire-breathing monsters. But as far as I know, Sam's bike here is still in its stock standard trim. Although for a bike that was initially just a road trail type of machine that owners then removed all of the lights and indicators and all of the other unnecessary road bike paraphernalia to turn them what was then into a full-blown scrambles machine that could certainly hold its own in the highly competitive 4-stroke class. But I do know for a fact that Sam Sibbald's been racing these kind of scrambles bikes for many years, and he's still quite quick in his maturing years, because I do remember as a younger man watching Sam racing in the schoolboy BSA Bantam scrambles back in the 1970s, and he was even quick at that time. But certainly look out for him on this TT Yamaha racing in the pre-1977 class. But I'm sure you're already aware that these TT Yamahas had the engine's motor oil inside the chassis, which was filled through that little filler plug there that you can see just in front of the alloy fuel tank. Now, as far as I'm aware, it's still the original TT 500 forks that are bolted onto Sam's bike, although I think he may have done a few tweaks on their internals, maybe just to stiffen them up for motocross racing. But this rear swing arm isn't, again, of course, the original part that was fitted to this bike in the 1970s, which I'm sure would have been a kind of tubular steel item and not this box section alloy part that's fitted here. Although without doubt this Yamaha's front and rear suspensions certainly would have had something done to them to stiffen it up for motocross use, because the standard TT500 Yamaha front and rear suspensions would probably have been far too soft to be of any use as a full-on motocrosser. Although it was, and in fact it still is, quite common for owners to use these old TTs as full-blown racing bikes, especially those 500 four-stroke engines, which do tend to get used in all manner of other chassis when riders are building hybrids, which is basically all down to the reputation and reliability of that fantastic Yamaha motor. Okay, so next on our list is a couple of nice German Michaels from Chris Rogerson, and Chris's first bike here is his 400, which as far as I can make out is sitting inside a 1981 chassis, but this again is another very quick bike, and I do remember Chris was riding this bike in the top 3 placings in the popular pre-1984 class at this round 6 meeting, although how he actually finished at the end of the day I'm not sure, but I'd be very surprised if he wasn't up there in the top 3. But once again, Chris's 400 is a piston port 2-stroke Michael motor, an absolute peach of an engine, as I remember, that had a good broad spread of usable power, which as you can guess is probably not just as fiery or brutal as its bigger 490 brother, but for your average club racer this was a perfect engine to keep you competitive and at the business end of the racing pack. But as per many of the other Michaels these days, the rear steel swing arms been changed for a much lighter box section alloy unit. And although these alloy swing arms are lighter and certainly look better than the original steel ones, some people say that they are not as strong as the original steel parts, and I've personally known a few cases where riders have reverted back to the stock steel items when cracks and breakages start to occur on these alloy components. So moving on to the back end of Chris's 400, it's a good quality pair of YSS piggyback shocks, which are a good choice for these twin shock Michaels, and these shocks are hugely popular with the riders who use them. But as I said, look out for Chris on the track when he races this 400 in the pre-1984 class, because although these 400s, as I said, weren't as quick as the daddy of them all, the mighty 490, it's actually quite surprising just how much power you can get out of these smaller 400s. And Chris, without doubt, certainly proved that on the day of the race. Okay, so as we move right along, this is Chris's second Michael racer, and this is his 1983 250, which, as you know, originally was a single monoshock bike in 1983, but this one's been converted to a twin shocker by fitting a twin shock rear swing arm onto the rear. Now, Chris did tell me that he was looking to sell this 250 bike, so if you think you might be in the market for a good reliable 250 twin shock race bike, then you can just give Chris a call on this number, and I'm sure he'll furnish you with all of the intricate details of this bike's construction. But certainly these 1983 engines had done away with those troublesome primary chains that were fitted to the earlier big Michael motors, and they've replaced them with a gear-driven crank and clutch drive assembly, which of course was much more practical and more reliable. Although despite the clutch and primary chain problems on the old motors, these 1983 engines again weren't exactly the most powerful 250s of their day, although they were pretty reliable and relatively easy for a home mechanic to fix if they ever needed any maintenance or repair. So basically, if this bike was an original 1983 model, it would have had Michael's box section steel dual control type of swing arm here at the back, and not this tubular 1981 twin shock item, which although still does a good job on our 83 bike, it isn't correct for its year of manufacture. But certainly don't let that little modification put you off if you think you might be interested in this machine, because these days you're never going to find an original unblemished Michael racer, because they're just not out there, and virtually 100% of the time an old Michael from the 1980s will have had some kind of downgrade or even upgrade in its life. So really, in terms of what Chris has actually done here to his 250 is quite mild in comparison to what others have done to their German Michael off-roaders. But without a doubt, this has been a couple of very quick Michael racers from Chris Rogerson. Okay, so moving right along to our next vintage classic, which is Ian Clark's quite nice looking B50 BSA, which as far as I know is a recent addition to Ian's off-road bike collection, who I think is actually another one of these owners that we need to visit sometime, because I think Ian's always been known to have a few nice classics tucked away in his Aladdin's cave of old motorcycles, so he's maybe another one of the owners that we need to pay a visit in the future. Now, I know that you're all just sitting out there patiently waiting on me telling you all of the gory details of all of the bike's components, when in actual fact I don't have a clue, because I was never given any information on this bike on the day that I grabbed these clips, because I was actually passing Ian's van, and he asked me to get some pictures of the bike before it got covered in Avonbridge dirt. So that's exactly what I did. And so as to what kind of chassis is on the bike, as I said, I don't know, but it's more than likely that it's a BSA frame of some kind or another, but certainly no mistaking this power plant, which is another example of one of BSA's B50 4-stroke motors, which not only powered their BSA road bikes away back in the day, these were also put to very good use by the late great Alan Clues, when he of course retuned them to put in his CCM frames, because we all know just how successful these engines became after Alan had worked his magic on what was at the time still a pretty bog standard BSA road bike engine. So with regards the bike's front forks, once again I just don't know their make or origins, but it could certainly be a handful of different manufacturers, although the Italian Serianis were a very popular front suspension system on these bikes back in the day, so who knows, they may even be exactly that, but then again, just in guessing mode once more. although at least the bike appears to still have the stock BSA alloy fuel tank, which was very easily recognisable way back in the 1950s and 60s. And Ian's tank here, as you can see, has had a custom yellow paint job done to it, and it also appears to still have the traditional Monza style locking fuel cap there on the top as well. And once more an alloy rear hub here on the back with those circular cutaways inside, which you can only assume was to reduce the overall weight of this part of the bike. And these rear shocks once again are certainly a bit of a mystery, because they had no visible markings to speak of, although they were quite long for an older BSA scrambler from that period, which, as I remember, these bikes had very little in the way of travel here at the rear end. But it certainly is a bit of a pity that we couldn't have extracted some details about Ian's bike on the day that I grabbed these clips. But if we ever receive the full details and the story on Ian's bike at a later date, then we'll then compile a full-length feature on this quite nice-looking BSA. But once again, another belter of a bike from Ian Clark. So this was another rare and interesting bike that I came across at this round 6 event at Avonbridge, and this is a very rare 1981 250 Italian Ancelotti, which I'm not going to get into on this Paddock video, because it's such an interesting and quite rare machine with quite a good background story as well. So what we're going to do is we'll give this bike its full moment of glory on CDB TV once we've finished posting all of the racing highlights from this round 6 Scottish Classic event. So make sure that you retune to my channel to take a look at this extremely rare machine. So there you have it. I do hope you enjoyed having that brief walk around the paddock, looking at some of those quite nice bikes that are soon to take part in this Scottish Classic Round 6 event. But don't forget, you can see all of those bikes and many more like them when they take to the track, when I post all of the racing highlights from this event. But until the next time, from all of us here at Avonbridge, it's goodbye for now.